Others of you are paid similar salaries for similar things, and any of you would be foolish as to write honest opinions, would be out on the streets looking for another job. If I allowed my honest opinions to appear in one issue of my paper, before 24 hours my occupation would be gone. The business of journalists is to destroy the truth, to lie outright, to pervert, to vilify, to fawn at the feet of Mammon, and to sell his country and his race for his daily bread. You know it and I know it. And what folly is this, toasting an independent press? We are the tools of rich men behind the scenes. We are jumping jacks. They pull our strings and we dance. Our talents, our possibilities and our lives are all property of other men. We as journalists are intellectual prostitutes. I don't think that's fair because some of them aren't that intellectual. Thank you. Dan Rather, one of the most recognisable anchormen in America, spoke to the BBC and claimed that after 9/11, American reporters were practising a form of self-censorship. He said there was a time in South Africa that people would put flaming tyres around people's necks if they dissented, and in some ways the fear is that you will be necklaced here. You will have a flaming tyre of a lack of patriotism put around your neck. Now, it is that fear that keeps journalists from asking the toughest of the tough questions. And again, I'm humbled to say that I do not accept myself from this criticism. What we are talking about here, whether one wants to recognise it or not, and call it by its proper name or not, is a form of self-censorship. Journalist Keith Olbermann also concurred, stating, "You can rock the boat, but you can never say that the entire ocean is in trouble. You cannot say, by the way, there's something wrong with our system." Bill Moyers, a reporter, also publicly criticised the American corporate media for repeatedly extolling the obviously false link between 9/11 and Iraq and the false claims that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, which the administration enthusiastically parroted in the run-up to the Iraq War. Moyers concluded that the false information was not challenged because the mainstream media had been cheerleaders for the White House from the beginning, and we were simply continuing to rally the public behind the president. No questions asked. Walter Isaacson, the former chairman and the CEO of CNN, revealed there was a patriotism police after 9/11, and when the network showed things critical of the administration's policies, it would get phone calls from advertisers and the administration and also big people in corporations who were calling up and saying, "Stop this, you're being anti-American." Now, the claim that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction has recently been revealed to be an admitted lie, coming from a single captured terrorist who gave the false information in order to gain leverage in the sentencing for his own crimes. And this was actually reported in the Independent. Curveball, the Iraqi defector who fabricated claims about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, smiles as he confirms how he made the whole thing up. It was a confidence trick that changed the entire course of history, with Rafid Ahmed Alwan al-Janabi's lies being used to justify the war. The chemical engineer claimed to have overseen the building of Mobile Biological Laboratory when he sought political asylum in Germany in 1999. His lies were presented as facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence by Colin Powell, US Secretary of State, when making the case for war at the Security Council in February 2003. US officials sexed up Mr. Janabi's drawings of mobile biological weapons labs to make them more presentable, and this was admitted by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, General Powell's former Chief of Staff. He said, "I brought the White House team in to do the graphics," adding, "Intelligence was being worked to fit the policy." The CNN network has also been exposed as a notorious focal point for Pentagon psychological operations, or PSYOPs. In 2000, the Pentagon confirmed that PSYOPs personnel, soldiers and officers have worked in the CNN headquarters in Atlanta. In February that year, Dutch journalist Abe de Vries reported on the presence of US Army personnel at CNN for the Dutch paper True. In it he said, "Major Thomas Collins, US Information Service has confirmed that PSYOPs personnel, soldiers and officers have worked in the CNN quarters in Atlanta. The Lend-Lease exercise was part of an Army program called Training with Industry. According to Collins, the soldiers and officers worked as regular employees of CNN. Conceivably, they would have worked on stories during the Kosovo War. They did help in the production of news." When asked if the introduction of military personnel into a civilian news organisation was standard operating procedure, one source who worked at CNN said, "To be honest, that question is above my pay grade, but I hope so because it is what I do for a job." Now, the CNN military personnel were members of the Air Mobile 4th Psychological Operation Groups who were usually stationed out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. One of the many tasks of the almost 1,200 soldiers and officers based at CNN was to spread selected information. Now, critics have said that this basically means dissemination of propaganda, which it does. Now, Andrew Card, the White House chief, explained his decision and the Bush administration's decision to delay the attack on Iraq until September by saying, "From a marketing point of view, you never introduce new products in August." Now, apparently war, like any other state of events, has to be marketed. It has to be bled into the public consciousness in order to be accepted and deemed as normal. To ensure maximum success, specific techniques have to be employed, and there are optimum times to do this to increase effectiveness. Miriam Schulman, the head of the Santa Clara University Center for Applied Ethics, noted the cynical manipulation of public opinion and actually published her thoughts in the same year. She said, "Am I the only one who's queasy that the Bush administration has quite publicly announced plans to sell us on war with Iraq in the same way as a soda pop company might hype a new soft drink?" When interviewed, Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who actually uncovered the Iraq prison torture scandal and also the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, gave a particularly scathing evaluation of the failures within the media industry. He said, "All the institutions we thought would protect us, particularly the press, but also the military, the bureaucracy, the Congress, they have failed. So all the things that we expect would normally carry us through didn't. The biggest failure, I would argue, is the press, because that's the most glaring." And he was asked by the reporter, "So, Seymour, what can be done to fix this situation?" And he had to think about it and said, "Well, you have to fire or execute 90% of the editors and executives. You'd actually have to start promoting people from the newsrooms to be editors. People who you didn't think that you could troll, and to be honest, they're never going to do that." A survey taken in the same year, 2003, revealed that 35% of journalists, reporters and news executives admitted that they regularly avoided stories if the story was thought to be embarrassing or damaging to the financial interests of the news company or the organisation's owners, shareholders or parent companies. Now, I just want you to contemplate these particular phrases with reference to modern news, particularly news that we're seeing recently with Iraq, Iran, Syria, Libya, all this sort of thing. Propaganda must be planned and executed by only one authority. Credibility alone must determine whether propaganda output should be true or false. Propaganda must label events and people with distinctive phrases or slogans like terrorist, Al-Qaeda, that sort of thing. Propaganda must facilitate the displacement of aggression by specifying the targets for hatred. Black rather than white propaganda may be employed when the latter is less credible or produces undesirable effects. To be perceived, propaganda must evoke the interests of an audience and must be transmitted through an attention-getting communications medium, Fox News Flash. Ever seen that? Propaganda to the home front must create an optimum anxiety level, Fox News Flash. Ever seen that? Right, they're all quotes from Joseph Goebbels. But it would be very easy to see how any of these maxims could actually be applied to today's sensationalist news media. Propaganda can effectively be termed as the deliberate shaping of events, real or perceived, in order to portray a particular pre-designated narrative to an audience. News media is often found guilty of this, and not all incidents can be passed off as an attempt to sensationalise or simplify a story purely to gain a larger audience share. In August 2011, the BBC Persian TV channel acknowledged the role of BBC Persian Radio in the 1953 coup which toppled the democratically elected government of the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. The overthrow of Mossadegh led to the restoration of absolute monarchy under dictator Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, as reported in Press TV. A documentary aired on August 18th on the anniversary of the coup BBC Persian channel admitted for the first time to the role of the BBC Persian radio as the propaganda arm of the British government in Iran. After repeated denials of the BBC Persian radio's role in helping London oust Mossadegh, the programme detailed how the radio network broadcast anti-Mossadegh propaganda to undermine the government. The British government used the BBC Persian radio for advancing its propaganda against Mossadegh, and anti-Mossadegh material was repeatedly aired on the radio channel to the extent that the Iranian staff at the BBC went on strike in protest. Another secret government document has since been leaked, and it gave an official summary of America's overthrow of Mossadegh and confirmed the means by which the media was employed in their efforts. In cooperation with the Department of State, CIA had several articles planted in America in major American newspapers and magazines, which when reproduced in Iran had the desired psychological effect and contributed to the war of nerves against Mossadegh. Famed Watergate reporter Carl Bernstein exposed the fact that the CIA has already bought and paid for many successful journalists. Now, he exposed this in an article that was titled The CIA and the Media, and this was actually published in the music magazine Rolling Stone because this was the only publication that would print it. The article actually forced George Bush Sr. to admit that more than 400 journalists have lived double lives, maintaining covert relationships with the CIA. For proof that this practice is still employed, particularly in the UK, you could always read Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers by David Shayler, which detailed how friendly journalists were being implanted in places like the Telegraph and the Guardian. In the 1950s, CIA agent Frank Wisner proudly and openly stated that he could play the media like a mighty Wurlitzer. Now, this was actually reported in the New York Times in 1997 by Joseph Cruden in an article titled Worldwide Propaganda Network Built by the CIA. Also stated in the article was the fact that in that year the CIA had already published over 1,200 books. Now, this actually led to the bizarre result of one CIA agent secretly working for a national media outlet giving a favourable review to a book written secretly and published secretly by the CIA. In fact, in 1991, a memo was discovered by CIA agent Ralph McGee, which claimed that the CIA had representatives in every single media outlet, representatives that could help shape and alter the news as they wished. The memo said, the PAO, the CIA's Public Affairs Office, now has relationships with reporters from every major wire service, newspaper, News Weekly and television network in the nation. This has helped turn some intelligence failure stories into intelligence success stories. In many instances, we have persuaded reporters to postpone, change, hold or even scrap stories completely. The periodical Armed Forces Journal International revealed that the Pentagon had published 371 separate magazines in the year 1971. Now, this is quite strange because this made the Pentagon 16 times larger than America's largest publishing house. Okay, the number increased to 1,203 different magazines published by the Pentagon by 1982. By the 1970s, a Senate intelligence report revealed that the CIA itself owned outright at least 200 wire services. Now, during the NATO-led regime change of Libya, presented in the West as yet another spontaneous uprising of the people running off the momentum of the Arab Spring, the media publicised false images of celebrations in Tripoli's Green Square, implying that the Gaddafi regime had in fact fallen to the rebels. This was actually shown on Al Jazeera and it was later repeated on the BBC. This was reported on prisonplanet.com. It said the fake scenery has purportedly been set up in Qatar for purposes of psychological manipulation. The Stop War Crimes website also reports that the footage showing victorious rebels in front of Gaddafi's Al Aziza compound could similarly have been faked. The fake footage serves two purposes, according to the Stop War Crimes blog: to break the Libyan resistance by creating panic and chaos in the Libyan capital, and to provide cover for the massacres of civilians that would occur in the days following the declaration of rebel victory. And this is basically it. Like this was a mock-up. This is the real one. This is a mock-up that was here, that was shown on Al Jazeera, and it was filmed in Qatar. But the article went on to highlight that the fact this is not the first time in recent years that Western media has portrayed the reality of an armed invasion in more sympathetic and ultimately false manner. The toppling of the Saddam Hussein statue in Firdos Square in central Baghdad on April 9, 2003 was the creation of an army psychological operations team that made it appear to be a spontaneous Iraqi undertaking, and this is according to the army's own internal study of the affair. Television pictures at the time showed close-up shots of jubilant Iraqis pulling down the statue as reporters from BBC News and other mainstream commentators boldly proclaimed the scene as an iconic moment in modern history, proving that the invasion of Iraq was really about liberating the people from tyrant and not some sort of crazy geopolitical conquest. However, when the wide shots of the scene were viewed, it became obvious that the event was the work of just a few dozen Iraqis led by Pentagon stooge Ahmed Chalabi, and not thousands of ordinary Iraqi people as the establishment media claimed at the time. This was again confirmed by an internal report commissioned by the army into their own practices and was reported in the Los Angeles Times. As the Iraqi regime was collapsing on April 9, 2003, Marines converged on Firdos Square in central Baghdad, site of an enormous statue of Saddam Hussein. It was a Marine colonel, not joyous Iraqi civilians, as was widely assumed from the TV images, who decided to topple the statue. The army report said, and it was a quick-thinking army psychological operation team that made it appear to be a spontaneous Iraqi undertaking. Now in the footage you can clearly see an American soldier draping a US flag across the face of Saddam's statue, followed immediately by another soldier who apparently had a direct line to the army PSYOPs team who asked for the flag to be removed. The PSYOPs team said this, they said God bless them, but we were thinking that this was just bad news. We didn't want to look like an occupation force, and some of the Iraqis were saying, no, we want an Iraqi flag. The Stars and Stripes were replaced with an Iraqi flag to imply that this was an organic uprising and portray the coalition of the willing, which is, you remember what we were called at the time, as heroes. But just to explain, this doesn't come out very well. This was a picture that was published on the BBC website that shows scores of dead people with a young child skipping between them. This was actually taken in early 2000 in Iraq. Sorry, this was actually taken in early 2000 in Iraq. This shows scores of dead bodies and a child skipping through. The person who actually took the photo got in touch with the BBC and made a complaint that they were presenting this as the result of massacres in Syria. Not only was it the wrong country, it was completely the wrong year, and the person who actually produced the photo got in touch with them to chastise them about this. In 2011, reports of rioting leading to the shooting of civilians by the Syrian government were flashed across Western media screens. Now, the reports seemed, at best, incomplete. All were secondary and all were taken from representatives outside of Syria's borders. A fake blog describing the terrible treatment gay women faced in Syria under the present regime circulated widely in the West, and its content was slavishly repeated in several publications. Now, after several weeks, it was actually revealed in the Guardian newspaper that the mysterious identity of a young Arab lesbian blogger who was apparently kidnapped last week in Syria has been revealed conclusively to be a hoax. The blogs were not written by a gay girl in Damascus, but by a middle-aged American man based in Scotland. Tom McMaster, a 40-year-old Middle East activist studying for a master's at Edinburgh University, posted an update declaring that rather than a 35-year-old feminist and lesbian called Amina Abdallah Araf al-Amari, he was the sole author of all posts on his blog. Now, without sounding too paranoid, this type of destabilising perception management technique has all the hallmarks of our own and US intelligence agencies. It is odd to note that McMaster's involvement was only revealed when he had actually relocated from Scotland to Turkey. Now, Turkey is obviously a country that has a vested interest in the destabilisation of Syria. Furthermore, McMaster's wife, Britta Frolicker, is studying at the University of St Andrews for a PhD in Syrian economic development. Now, this is purely speculative, of course, but if, God forbid, there was a Western-sponsored invasion of Syria, PhDs in economic development would be ideally placed for the inevitable rebuilding of the infrastructure. Now, this has not gone unnoticed close to the region, with several journalists from the Al Jazeera news organisation resigning in protest of the biased coverage. A former employee of the Arab satellite network Al Jazeera says the news channel fabricates stories on the unrest in Syria. The facts are totally different from the reports in the media, extremely different. Reuters quoted Moused Ahmed, a former producer for Al Jazeera's Beirut bureau, as saying. Ahmed said the channel concealed many facts, with editors' opinions becoming the so-called facts, adding, "I am sorry that we concealed facts for so long a time." Ahmed is one of 5 Al Jazeera employees in Lebanon who resigned from the TV station over the channel's biased stance on Syria in the middle of March. Al Jazeera is also accused of blowing the opposition movement in Syria out of proportion and covering up the truth in the country. It is widely believed that the Emir of Qatar has a direct influence on the nature of programmes broadcast on Al Jazeera. You remember, it was Qatar where they filmed the fake Libya things. In addition, the Qatari-based network's biased policy towards Bahrain and Libya has caused dispute among the news network staff. Al Jazeera employees were concerned that the Syrian government was, in their opinion, unfairly being painted as a monster, when in fact the regimes of Bahrain were mercilessly slaughtering its own civilians and citizens, and this was being kept quiet. Many employees at Al Jazeera News Channel are resigning over the Qatari-based network's biased coverage of events taking place in the Middle East. While Al Jazeera has gained a reputation for its coverage of the Tunisian, Egyptian and Libyan revolutions, the broadcaster has remained almost silent over the massive anti-government protests in Bahrain and Myanmar's brutal crackdown on the popular uprising. Al Jazeera is also accused of fabricating whole stories about Libya and Syria and even staging its own footage at undisclosed locations. Al Jazeera is also said to be forcing editors to give the stories a twist to benefit the state of Qatar's political views. Yes, a famous incident of media misinformation occurred on the afternoon of 9/11. The BBC reported that the Salomon Brothers building, also known as World Trade Center Building 7, had collapsed. The live shot of the reporter at the scene in New York had the Salomon Brothers building in clear view, still standing just over the reporter's left shoulder. There it is. Okay, despite this seemingly glaring elephant in the room, the field reporter and the in-studio anchor repeated the obviously premature statement that the building had collapsed. Mysteriously, seconds prior to the actual collapse of the building, the live feed disintegrated in a shower of electrical interference. This is literally 5 minutes before the building actually collapsed. Now, I'm not going to go as far as some have gone, right? Okay, I'm not accusing the BBC of being involved in the attack. I'm not even going to go as far as to say they had prior knowledge of the events that would unfold that day, right? Personally, and some might disagree, but I don't even believe that the reporters shown on the screen were aware that the information they were regurgitating was at that point false. What this does prove, however, beyond a shadow of a doubt, is that journalists and news media organisations do not check the facts in all cases before slavishly repeating them as gospel. The media is becoming more cut and paste, with journalists acting more like mouthpieces for an organisational standpoint. They repeat the pre-typed scripts laid before them mere seconds after rushing out of makeup. The question is therefore, is this type of mistake an unfortunate result of an industry that demands more and more in a field of dramatic presentation to the detriment of truth, or is this not a mere oversight but the purposeful tactic of some malignant agency? Propaganda is essential in framing any foreign intervention, and specifically for positioning ourselves as the heroes fighting some monstrous, inhuman adversary. We have to demonise on the microcosm in army training to allow for the recruits to be able to kill another human, but also in the macrocosm to justify and normalise the ensuing death and destruction in the minds of the public. Essentially, we need to justify the deaths to two groups of people: those who actually carry out the grim slaughter, and the masses who, by implication, allow it to happen. From the very beginning of the First World War, Wellington House, the precursor to the Tavistock Institute, spread spurious stories about the advancing German army's treatment of Belgian civilians. Eyewitness accounts spread through the media told of numerous atrocities, specifically German troops impaling babies on their bayonets, dismembering children so that they could not grow old and seek violent retribution, and amputating the breasts of women for their own cruel enjoyment. Tales of mass organised rapes were also commonplace, and the scenarios often had similar characteristics. The women of a village were supposedly gathered up, often thrown over a table in the town square, and gang raped while the rest of the German soldiers cheered encouragement and waited their turn. These reports, it should be added, were never ever substantiated and were actually were vigorously denied, not only by the German army but also by Allied reporters that were in the area covering the developments of the war. Kaiser Wilhelm in the First World War was portrayed in propaganda as a ruthless brute and was given the nickname the Butcher of Berlin. Now, prior to the First Gulf War, the Western media was awash with reports that Iraqi troops in Kuwait were dragging newborn babies from incubators and dashing them to death on the cold concrete floors. Televised and repeated everywhere was the tearful eyewitness account of these murders by a young girl to President George Bush. Now, this was apparently influential in swaying his opinion to seek permission from the Senate to begin attacking Iraq. The stories transpired to be a complete and total fabrication, and they were admittedly the product of the imaginations of Hilton and Knowles. Hilton and Knowles is a public relations agency with ties and funding from the Tavistock Institute in London. And this was a crafted falsehood designed to snare the moral justification of the war in the eyes of the general public. This is the girl in question. She tearfully recounted her horrific memories of the atrocities. Now, this girl just so happened to be the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the US, and she'd met President George Bush literally dozens of times. Her father was friends with